How's everybody doing? I'm going to try to get through this video as quickly as possible because right now there is an overinflated amount of instruments in here, and if I don't do this quickly I won't be able to go to bed anytime soon. Basically, I know people like guitar collection videos. This is probably the highest sheer number of guitars that I'm going to have anytime soon because I need to shed a few off. So I figured I would do this video now. Basically, I'm going to run through all my instruments. I'm going to start with basses, then go to acoustics, then go to the electrics, I'm going to sort them from least to greatest importance in each category, and we're just going to try to get through them with quick descriptions. There's going to be no playing in this video. A lot of these guitars have already been demoed, so you can look for some of those demo videos on my channel if you want to. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I'm starting with basses for less importance just because I'm not a bass player. This was my very first bass that I ever got just to do some recording with it. It is a SX, essentially copy of a jazz bass. This is actually a decent bass for the money. I mean, even to this day, it's really not bad quality. It has no problems with it. It's an ash body, maple fretboard, maple neck, just sort of jazz bass copy. Now moving on to the bass that I basically just strictly use anymore. This is my Schecter Stiletto Custom 4. Got this one a little while back from a friend, and this bass has some nice dark tones to it. It's got a 5-piece neck, gold hardware, active pickups. There's a cutoff point where there's an active boost for the pickups, so it has pretty good versatility to it. It's one of these world music instruments from Korea, so you know it's good quality. And it has a color coordinated strap. Moving on to acoustics, this is basically my first acoustic. This is a Douglas. As you can see, I was on a kick of rondo music stuff. You got the SX, got the Douglas. You're going to see a couple of Agiles when I go to electrics. But this basically was my first acoustic sort of workhorse that I used for quite a while. It actually has aged, even though it's like a just cheap poly finish guitar. If you're wondering why it only has 5 strings, this is the one that I did with the banjo strings, and I have not changed them since then. This guitar has a collapsed bridge, unfortunately, so it's pretty much not worth anything to me at this point. Kind of debating if I should like somehow spectacularly destroy this thing or try to give it away to a good home, although the bridge is kind of annoying, so I don't know. We'll see what this guitar's fate actually is. Next up on acoustics in order of importance, we have my Orangewood Ray Mahogany. This one I got right around New Year's. I'd seen some hype about them and they're extremely cheap. I got this with like an Amazon gift card balance that I had. This one has a really nice neck to it. It's actually a really good sounding guitar. I'm still continuing to be impressed by this, especially when you consider the price. I mean, this thing is like unbeatable. It's actually just a good guitar, period. Moving on to the most important acoustic that I have. This is my vintage Martin 0018. This is a pre-truss rod model. This thing's got the open back Grovers, really cool guitar, super old. This actually is super important to me because this belongs to my grandmother. So this actually was inherited. Basically, I just sort of maintain it. I don't really use it a whole lot. But due to the history of it, this guitar is really important to me. Plus, it's a really cool example of a historic guitar. Moving on to electrics, I'm putting this as the least important because this guitar is actually still not finished. This was the project guitar that I started building a little while back and then I just gave up on. It does exist. I should probably give this thing some TLC and try to resuscitate it and try to get it finished because this has almost $1,000 worth of parts put into it already and it has the potential to be really cool, and I just kind of gave up because I hated building a guitar, it turned out. But it came along pretty well up to the point that it's at. Now, the least important functioning electric, if you want to call it that. So this guitar is extremely dusty. This was the second workhorse that I used basically through like middle school and high school that my parents got me. It's an Agile Dauntless from Rondo Music. At this point, this thing is pretty old, although it's in decent shape considering the amount of use that it got. The frets are a little bit worn down. But this was actually my backup to my main workhorse, which is why it is less important than that. So pay close attention here. This is my main former workhorse from my high school playing days. You'll notice that the pickups were swapped in both of these. This one is an AL 2000, so it didn't start off quite as high spec as the Dauntless, but I upgraded the pickups in both of them. This is the actual guitar that I used the most. It played the best to me despite having a cheaper nut. The frets are actually like visibly worn. This is like, I don't know if you can really see that, but it's got like divoted frets like right in there. I don't know if that comes across on camera or not, but this is basically the guitar that I learned to shred on, so I really wore this thing down a bit. Both of these have DiMarzio Tone Zone and Air Norton pickups, just different colors. Pretty quickly we've gotten to my newest guitar on this list as far as importance, although this I kind of got as a tool to use, something that had a whammy. Obviously this is the Ibanez Steve Vai Signature Gem Junior version, so this is not the full fat one. For being a $450 or $500 guitar, this thing is shockingly good. It's Indonesian. I do plan to do a handful more videos with this. I've actually done this one pretty recently. If you just go back a few videos on the channel, you should see it. This thing though, you really cannot beat for a $500 guitar. This is like unbelievably good. I will say the quality of some of these Indonesian guitars is getting pretty impressive. And then speaking of Indonesian guitars with impressive quality, this is my Chapman ML2 Standard Series. This one ranks slightly higher than the Ibanez for importance just because both of these two guitars, they don't get a lot of playtime from me, but they both are here for a reason. So Steve Vai is somewhat of an inspiration. That guitar design is super iconic. I mean, it'd be hard to avoid, you know, being influenced by his stuff. But just from my own personal journey, a larger influence would have been Rob Chapman and the whole YouTube era. I mean, I was like basically right out of high school, started watching his stuff when I was living in Ohio, and he really got me of the mindset that there are nice guitars that you can actually afford. I mean, coming to that point, I was just still beating those two Agiles just to death, just overplaying on them and really, you know, asking too much out of them. And at that time, the Chapman Korean series was all that existed. So this series didn't exist yet. If you looked way back on my channel, you'd see that I actually had 3 original Korean Chapmans that I wish I hadn't gotten rid of. I mean, I got rid of them basically around when I moved because I didn't want to move like 20 something odd guitars at that time. But even just the money value of those things is going up. And I think that I sold those at a low point and it was kind of a regret. And they were also just great guitars, but after I started getting my Gibsons, I wasn't really using them. Anyway, to cut back to this particular guitar, this is a Trans Black. This thing has a pretty nice flame top, although it's hard to come across with this particular lighting that's going on in here, but it's a Trans Black. Basically, this guitar has been played by the original owner. I've never been a particular fan. I mean, the first Chapman that I got was an ML2. That was one of those Korean ones with just a plain wood finish. But in comparison to like the size of a Gibson body, these are just too small for me. But the reason that I picked up this one after I sold all my original ones was simply because it's signed by Rob Chapman and Rabia Masad. This is something that I saw when I was just sort of browsing listings, because I just look at guitar listings all the time just to kind of see where things sit in the market. And at that point I was looking for Chapmans and I saw this one was actually signed and it was like, I think $350. which is a staggering price for a guitar of this quality, first off, and second of all, it's signed by the owner of the company and Rabia Masad, who is one of my favorite guitarists of all time. So there was no chance in hell that I could pass this up. And I basically don't play this. This just stays in its bag in the closet. This one really is basically like a collector piece for me. Now we are moving on to the heavy hitters. This is the very first Gibson that I ever got. So this is the guitar that I graduated from all those Chapmans and like all those world music instruments that are great quality. Finally graduated to this. I bought this one from Sweetwater because it was a 2015 model, which people hated. I actually found all of the specs appealing just from a playability and performance standpoint. And then from the beginning of the year until the end of the year, these things dropped in price like $600. And I bought this one brand new. Originally, this would have had the 57 Classics with brushed chrome, or I guess brushed aluminum, whatever you'd call it. The covers would have matched the bridge and tailpiece. This has the self-tuning, it has the height adjustable brass nut, the wide fretboard. I mean, it has some great playing features. It has coil splits on it. So this thing, although the color was not my favorite, they only offered the Studio that year in Desert Burst, Manhattan Midnight, or I think there was like just a cherry red, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, in hindsight, Manhattan Midnight would have been more desirable as a color, but this is just a great, it's this top by itself on a Studio. It has some decent flame, if you can kind of see that from certain angles. So, I mean, this is not a bad guitar by any means. The sentiment of it being my first Gibson, I mean, this is the first guitar that I actually got where when I picked it up, it sent like chills down my entire body. And it's just such a well-playing guitar. And this is the one that got me hooked from that point on getting Gibsons. I mean, this thing really impacted me that much when I first got it. Moving on, this is actually a different guitar, not the one that you just saw. So, as you might guess, with having those two nearly identical Agiles with the same electronics, I decided to duplicate my 2015 Les Paul Studio as well. Don't ask me why, I just was of this mentality at that time, I guess, that if something's good, you should have it twice. And I did the exact same pickup swap, although I didn't mention that these are very high output ceramics. These are the 500T and I think 496R. In both guitars, they're identical. This one was picked up used in 2016, and if you notice, this one actually does not have the flame top sort of down the middle like the other one does, although it has some flame on the side. But I mean, it's a Studio, so they're not supposed to really have flames at all. This one, because it doesn't have quite as much sentiment, and because I really don't play either of these two anymore, probably going to sell this one sometime in the near future. Next up on the list is my 2005 Les Paul Platinum. This guitar I have featured on the channel before. When I saw some of these things and just discovered this Platinum model, I was like blown away, and I couldn't believe that I never heard of it before. I guess this was like a very limited run that they did in the early 2000s. And the Platinum attributes were basically the brushed metal tuners and hardware and the pickup ring toppers. It's just this whole, you know, the silver knobs like you would never see in anything else. It's like this very monochrome look, although they actually came in different colors besides silver, but then it wasn't monochrome. So I decided to seek out one that was silver and in very good shape. And this thing was a decent price used, therefore, but totally worth it in my opinion. I mean, this is one of the coolest guitars that I've ever played. I would like to never get rid of this unless I absolutely had to. This thing has like a baseball bat neck on it. It makes no sense. I mean, for how this thing looks, it feels like you're playing like a 50s Les Paul. And then of course the completely blank ebony fretboard is a really cool touch. I love this thing. We're almost at the end here. Next up is my 2016 Les Paul Studio. This was the year that they went back to offering traditional specs as an option after the 2015 debacle, which I actually liked. But I always had wanted a white Les Paul, as you might have guessed by my white Agiles that I got when I had no money as a middle schooler and high schooler. So when I finally could afford one and they actually made them new in that model year, I went out and got this new in 2016 or 17. That might have been old stock, but it was basically new out of Guitar Center. In this particular year, they used a Granadillo fretboard, which is a totally unique feature, and it makes a profound difference in the way that this guitar actually performs. I actually rank this above the Platinum just because this guitar sounds phenomenally good. I actually want to shoot this thing out against my Les Paul Custom because I think it would be really, I mean, they don't sound the same. This has a very different sort of tonal characteristic, but it would be really interesting to just compare two tones with such high quality to them, because this thing sounds great. I love this guitar. It's so satisfying to play just because it sounds phenomenal, and I love the white look. And now, of course, we have finally reached the end with my 2021 brand new Gibson Custom, Les Paul Custom in Alpine White. This guitar was my true dream guitar for my entire time of being aware as a guitar player. And I finally decided that I needed to get one this year, and this really has not disappointed me at all. This thing is a complete monster. And it's effortless to play, which is like a weird contrasting dynamic, but this thing, playing on this thing sometimes just, it's so effortless, it feels like you're shredding in slow motion. It's like phenomenal. But this is the ultimate guitar that I always had wanted, and I finally just got one pretty recently. So there you have it, 2021 Les Paul Custom. Love this thing. This is my go-to anymore, which because of that I need to slim down some of the rest of my guitars. So I want to sell my second 2015 that I built after the first one because it has a lot less sentiment to me, and I want to potentially sell, or I may just give away free to a good home, one of my Agiles, because they're not even really worth as much as the pickups that are in those things. So aside from those few guitars that are basically just duplicates that they're more just taking up space at this point, they don't have sentiment, I could stand to pass those ones on, but that would still leave me with like 13 guitars or something like that, which seems like a lot, but with everything else having its place, I mean, in my head, I feel like I have like 3 good guitars, but that in the room, there's like guitars all around me. So how does that work? So anyway, that footage is still fairly long, even though I tried to run through those as fast as I could. Feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts down below. Let me know which one was your favorite. If you like this video, don't forget to share it and subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you guys next time.